Mark Reynolds was a man of quiet strength. Having served in the military for nearly 2 decades, he had seen and experienced things that would have broken most people. But Mark was different. His service had left him with physical injuries that still ached, reminders of the sacrifices he'd made. The scars weren't just on his body, his finances had taken a hit too. After leaving the military, Mark struggled to find stable work, his health making it hard to hold down any long-term job. With limited options, he rented a small, run-down apartment in a forgotten part of town. It wasn't much, but it was all he could afford. The landlord, Carl Dawson, knew the situation. Carl was a man who didn't care about hardship or sympathy. He was only interested in money and had no patience for tenants who couldn't pay on time. He had a reputation for kicking people out without a second thought, regardless of their circumstances. Mark had been able to keep up with rent for a while, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before Carl came knocking. It was a chilly Tuesday morning when Mark received the knock on his door. He knew what it was about before he even opened it. Standing there in his worn-out suit, Carl Dawson scowled at him, holding an envelope in his hand. "Rent's late again, Reynolds," Carl said coldly, his voice dripping with disdain. "It's the second time this month. I'm not in the business of babysitting freeloaders." Mark felt his stomach tighten. He had been trying his best to make ends meet, but his health had been worsening, and the work he'd picked up wasn't paying enough to cover his bills. Still, he had always managed to scrape together something. This time, though, he'd fallen short by just a few days. I'm really sorry, Carl," Mark began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I've been struggling with some medical bills. I'll get it to you by the end of the week, I promise. Just a few more days, please." But Carl wasn't interested in excuses. His eyes narrowed, his lips curled into a sneer. "You think I care about your problems?" he spat. "You're just another lazy, worthless veteran who can't manage his life. Maybe if you'd worked harder instead of playing soldier, you wouldn't be in this mess." The words stung like a slap to the face. Mark opened his mouth to say something, but Carl cut him off, his voice rising. "You've got until noon to get out of here. No more free rides. Pack your things and go, or I'll call the cops." Mark felt the heat rise in his chest, a mix of anger and humiliation. He had served his country, risked his life, and yet here he was, being treated like garbage by a man who couldn't care less about his sacrifice. But he had no choice. With a heavy heart, Mark turned away, slowly gathering his few belongings. The apartment, once a place of solace, now felt like a prison. He didn't know where he would sleep that night, but the only thing that mattered was getting out before things escalated further. As he walked out of the building, Carl stood in the doorway, watching him with a cruel smile. The neighbors whispered, but no one stepped forward to help. Mark didn't look back. He had learned long ago that the world wasn't always kind, especially when you had nothing left to give. The streets were unforgiving. Mark wandered aimlessly, his feet sore from walking all day, the cold biting into his skin like needles. It wasn't even winter yet, but the chill of the evening air made it feel like the world was closing in on him. He didn't know where to go. All he had were the few belongings he'd managed to carry with him, his old duffel bag, a couple of worn jackets, and the memories of a life he used to have. Finding shelter was a daily struggle. Most nights he slept on park benches or under bridges, anything to escape the cold and the loneliness. There were nights when his stomach growled, the hunger gnawing at him relentlessly, but all he could afford was a cheap cup of coffee, or a stale loaf of bread from a corner store. He watched as people walked by, their lives unaffected by the man sitting on the pavement, hoping for a kind glance or a bit of change, but none came. One evening, as he huddled on a bench, trying to stay warm, he noticed an older man sitting nearby, his face weathered and tired. Mark could tell the man was in a similar situation. Despite his own hunger, Mark reached into his bag and pulled out the last of his bread, breaking it in half and offering a piece to the stranger. "Here," Mark said quietly. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." The old man looked at him with surprise, before nodding in thanks. "God bless you, son," he said, his voice raspy. It was a small act of kindness, but for a moment, Mark didn't feel so alone. Even in the worst of times, he still remembered the importance of compassion. But the darkness of his situation was heavy, and it was then that he heard a familiar voice calling his name. "Mark, is that you?" He turned to see a face he hadn't seen in years, James Carter, an old friend from his military days. James had always been like a brother to him, and seeing him again was like a light breaking through the clouds. "James," Mark said, his voice filled with relief. "I didn't know where else to go." James frowned as he took in Mark's disheveled appearance. "You look like hell, man. What happened?" Mark sighed deeply, his eyes briefly clouded with the pain of his situation. "It's a long story. I lost my place, just need to get back on my feet." Without hesitation, James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone. I can help. I've got some work lined up, and I've got a couch with your name on it. Come with me." For the first time in days, Mark felt a flicker of hope. James's kindness was a lifeline, and Mark clung to it like a drowning man to a rope. Maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. It was a Thursday evening when Carl Dawson's worst nightmare began to unfold. He had been sitting in his office, counting the money from his latest batch of rent checks, when he smelled something faintly burning. At first he dismissed it, just another faulty appliance in one of his buildings. But as the smell grew stronger, panic started to creep in. He stood and walked into the hallway, his eyes widening as smoke began to billow from the walls. His heart skipped a beat. It was the old wiring. He had known it was a problem for months, but he had been too cheap to fix it. He had ignored the complaints from tenants, figuring they were just trying to avoid paying for repairs. Now, the fire was spreading quickly. The sound of crackling flames grew louder, and Carl's panic set in. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. "Fire at my building, apartment building on 5th and Oak. It's bad, real bad." The dispatcher's calm voice did nothing to ease his growing terror. "Stay outside, sir. Firefighters are on their way." Carl dropped the phone, his mind racing. He couldn't just stand there. His tenants were still inside, including his wife Linda, and their young son Josh. He bolted up the stairs to the second floor, his mind frantic. The smoke was thick, the heat unbearable. He coughed, his throat burning, but he pressed on, shouting for his family. "Linda! Josh!" he yelled, voice hoarse with fear. He found Linda in their apartment, packing up their things in a panic. "We need to go, Carl. Now," she screamed, pulling Josh towards the door. Carl nodded, trying to keep his composure, but his heart was pounding. They stumbled down the stairs, but the flames had already begun to block the main exit. The building was in chaos, people running and shouting in every direction. Carl's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but the fire was everywhere, trapping them inside. When the sirens of the fire trucks finally wailed in the distance, Carl's relief was short-lived. The fire department arrived quickly, but the building's narrow hallways and old structure made it difficult for them to access all parts of the building. The flames raged on, the smoke thick and suffocating. Carl stood on the sidewalk, watching helplessly as firefighters battled the blaze. His tenants, some of whom were still inside, were in danger. His own family had barely escaped, but the fire continued to rage, threatening to destroy everything. Carl's hands shook as he clutched his head, realizing the disaster he had caused by neglecting the building's safety for years. What had he done? His eyes burned from the smoke as he watched the fire climb higher, and he finally knew the truth. It was too late for him to fix this. All his money, all his greed, nothing could save him now. As Mark walked down the street, still adjusting to his new life and the kindness his friend James had shown him, he was startled by the sound of sirens blaring in the distance. At first he thought it was just another emergency somewhere else in the city, but as he approached the corner, the sight of thick, black smoke rising into the sky caught his attention. The building that Carl Dawson owned, the one Mark had been evicted from only days before, was burning. Mark's heart raced. His first instinct was to run away, to stay out of the chaos. After all, he owed Carl nothing. But then a familiar feeling stirred in his chest, the same feeling that had kept him going through battles overseas. The feeling of duty, of wanting to help those in need, no matter the personal cost. He didn't hesitate. With the sound of crackling flames growing louder, Mark bolted toward the building. He pushed through the growing crowd of onlookers, ignoring their curious stares and murmurs. The smoke was thick, choking him with every breath, but he pressed forward, his soldier instincts kicking in. He knew how to handle a crisis. The front of the building was already engulfed in flames, but Mark spotted a side entrance and rushed toward it. The fire had not yet spread completely to that part of the building, but he knew time was running out. He pushed open the door and ran inside, his boots pounding against the old floors. Inside, the smoke was suffocating. Mark's vision blurred as he tried to navigate the burning hallways. The walls were hot to the touch, and the heat seemed to radiate from every direction. But he didn't stop. He heard coughing, desperate cries for help. His eyes darted to a second-floor balcony, where a woman was shouting for her child. Without thinking, Mark sprinted up the stairs, ignoring the pain in his knees. At the top, he saw a small child, Carl's son Josh, trapped behind a door that had been blocked by debris. The door was already smoldering from the flames creeping closer. Mark didn't hesitate. He kicked the door down, grabbing Josh and pulling him into his arms. The boy was crying, but Mark didn't stop. He dashed back down the stairs, using his shoulder to shield Josh from the heat. As he reached the bottom, he spotted an elderly woman struggling to move through the thick smoke. "Come with me," Mark called, pulling her into his arms as he moved toward the exit. He barely made it outside before collapsing to his knees, exhaustion overwhelming him. The firefighters had finally arrived in full force, and they rushed to take control of the situation. But Mark couldn't stay awake. His body, worn from the years of service and the rush of the rescue, gave out. He had given everything he had, every ounce of strength, every bit of energy to save those people. As the firefighters took over, Mark collapsed on the pavement, his breath shallow and labored. His arms ached, his head spun, but he had done what he came to do. He had saved lives, even if it meant risking his own. When Carl Dawson arrived at the hospital, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had barely slept since the fire, the images of the building he'd neglected burning into his mind. The fire was his fault. He had known the wiring was faulty, but had ignored it, all to save a few bucks. It wasn't just the building that had been affected, it was people's lives, including his own son, who had narrowly escaped with his life. And then there was Mark. Carl couldn't stop thinking about the man he had evicted just days ago. The man he had called a freeloader, the one he'd dismissed without a second thought. And now, that same man had saved his son's life, along with several other tenants. Mark had risked everything, despite Carl's cruel treatment. Carl's guilt was overwhelming. He walked into the hospital room, his footsteps hesitant. Mark was lying in a bed, bruised and battered, but alive. His face was pale, his eyes closed in exhaustion. Carl stood at the doorway for a moment, unsure of how to approach the man who had shown him more grace than he deserved. "Mark." Carl's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes fluttered open, surprised to see his former landlord standing there. Carl took a step forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know where to begin. I treated you terribly. I called you names, kicked you out, and I was wrong, so wrong." Mark remained silent, watching Carl carefully. "I've been thinking about everything," Carl continued, his voice cracking. "The fire, the way I treated you, you saved my son, you saved people I've never even bothered to get to know. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." Mark finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "You don't need to apologize to me, Carl. I did what anyone would have done. I'm just glad I could help." Carl swallowed hard, his eyes brimming with tears. "You deserve more than what I gave you, Mark. I want to make things right. I'm offering you a new place to stay, rent-free for the first few months, and a chance to rebuild. And I swear, I'm going to be a better landlord, and a better person." Mark looked at Carl, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. But Carl nodded firmly, guilt still weighing heavily on his chest. "I do. I owe you more than that." Mark didn't respond right away, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe people could change, even when they seemed beyond redemption. And maybe, just maybe, Carl's offer wasn't just about a place to stay, it was the beginning of a new chapter, for both of them. Mark, though still cautious, accepted Carl's apology. It wasn't easy. Trust didn't come quickly, especially after the way he'd been treated. But Carl's sincerity was undeniable, and Mark knew it was time to start over. With James's help, Mark found a steady job at a local construction company, one that allowed him to use his skills, while also helping him keep his medical costs manageable. Slowly, Mark began to rebuild his life, one step at a time. Carl kept his word, offering Mark a place to stay in a new building, rent-free for a few months. True to his promise, Carl treated his tenants with newfound respect, making sure their living conditions improved, and even lowering rents for those who struggled, like Mark once had. Mark's quiet strength, and his willingness to help others, even after all the wrongs he had endured, began to ripple through the building. He became a silent example of resilience and kindness, showing others that even in the darkest times, a person could rise above. His simple acts of generosity, helping his neighbors when they needed it most, spread throughout the building, creating a sense of community that had been absent before. Carl noticed the changes in himself too. The man who had once been driven solely by money, now found fulfillment in making amends, in offering help where he could. The story ends with a powerful message. Kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change hearts, heal wounds, and inspire others to be better, no matter what the past holds. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story of resilience, redemption, and the power of kindness. Mark's journey reminds us that no matter how tough life gets, there's always room for change, compassion, and new beginnings. We hope this story inspired you just as much as it moved us. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, comment, and share this message of hope with your friends and family. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that will leave you inspired. Thanks again for being a part of our community.